We tend to think of voting as a fundamental right, don't we? But what if I told you that just a couple of centuries ago, it was anything but? It was a super exclusive privilege. In this explainer, we're going to trace the dramatic, hard-fought journey to expand the vote in three very different nations: the United Kingdom, the United States, and Romania, all between 1800 and 1950.
So, get this. In the early United States, only about 6% of the entire population was actually eligible to vote. Just 6%! And that wasn't some weird anomaly. Across the world, the ballot box was basically locked tight for the vast majority of people. Even in the UK, fewer than 1 in 10 adult men could cast a vote. It's kind of wild to think about.
And here's the crucial thing to understand. The idea that everyone should get a vote, that just wasn't baked into the system back in the early 1800s. Not even close. Your ability to vote came down to what you owned, the color of your skin, and your gender. And that right there set the stage for more than a century of intense struggle and reform.
All right, so let's kick things off in the United Kingdom. Its electoral system at the time was notoriously unequal. It was a system just crying out for change. And that change would end up sending ripples across the entire globe.
Okay, you have to hear about this fascinatingly corrupt concept, rotten boroughs. Imagine an electoral district with just a handful of voters, maybe all controlled by a single wealthy landowner. While that tiny district got to send 2 members to parliament, the exact same number as a booming industrial city. It was a system literally designed to keep power locked in the hands of a tiny elite.
Now, this timeline shows how change didn't happen in one big bang. It was a series of hard-won steps. The 1832 Great Reform Act was the first real crack in the dam, bringing the powerful middle class into politics. Then, just a few decades later, the 1867 Act doubled the number of voters by giving the vote to many working-class men in cities. By 1884, most adult men, including farm laborers, were finally included. But the biggest leap, the real game-changer, came after the massive upheaval of World War I. In 1918, property rules for men were finally scrapped, and, critically, women over 30 got the vote. Full equality at the ballot box was finally achieved a decade later, in 1928.
The UK's journey was so influential that its Westminster system is often called the mother of parliaments. Its gradual, reform-based approach really played a vanguard role, basically providing a model for other countries looking to expand democracy.
Now let's cross the Atlantic. The American story is different. It wasn't about reforming Parliament. It was about fighting huge battles over states' rights and amending the Constitution itself.
In the early U.S., the states made the rules, and the rule was pretty simple: no property, no vote. But between 1792 and 1856, a pretty profound shift happened. State by state, those property qualifications were dismantled. This all led to the landmark 1828 election, the very first where a white man's right to vote didn't depend on how much land he owned. After the Civil War, the Constitution made a monumental promise. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, declared that the right to vote could not be denied because of race. For millions of newly freed African American men, this was supposed to be the dawn of a whole new era.
But that promise was brutally broken. As the Reconstruction era ended, Southern states put in place a whole system of Jim Crow laws specifically designed to disenfranchise black voters. They used things like poll taxes, impossible literacy tests, and these tricky grandfather clauses that cleverly exempted white voters. All that, combined with systemic violence, effectively wiped the 15th Amendment off the books in the South for nearly a century. This chart really illustrates how staggered the expansion of voting was in the U.S. These milestones happened decades apart. First, property rules were dropped for most white men by the 1850s. Then, African American men were granted the right, at least in theory, in 1870. Women won their long, hard-fought battle with the 19th Amendment in 1920. And finally, it wasn't until 1924 with the Indian Citizenship Act that all Native Americans were granted citizenship and the vote. And even then, some states still found ways to block them from the polls for years.
Our final case study takes us to Romania, a nation whose path to democracy was shaped by unification, building a constitution, and dealing with immense political turbulence.
Romania's democratic institutions were really built steadily from the ground up. They had early elections in the 1830s, and by 1864, after the country unified, they had a regular parliamentary system going. A huge milestone came in 1930 when women were allowed to vote in local elections for the first time. This progressive step was then cemented in the 1938 Constitution, which gave all adult women the right to vote in parliamentary elections. But, as we're about to see, all this hard-won progress was incredibly fragile.
And what's so tragic about Romania's story is that just as it was solidifying these democratic norms, its political landscape was just violently reshaped. The period ended not with a consolidated democracy, but with the beginning of decades of communist rule, after the elections of 1946 and 1948, which completely altered the very meaning of voting.
So, what we've seen are three very distinct stories: gradual parliamentary reform in the UK, constitutional clashes in the US, and a really turbulent state-building process in Romania. Let's pull it all together.
This side-by-side comparison makes the different paths crystal clear. The UK used a series of acts of parliament. The US relied on changes to state laws and, ultimately, powerful amendments to its national constitution. And Romania's journey was defined by creating its own constitutional and electoral laws. Different methods, different timelines, but all of them pointing toward a broader democracy.
If there's one single thing to take away from all this, it's this: the right to vote wasn't just granted, it was won. It's an achievement, the result of protest, of political maneuvering, and of a constant, evolving reevaluation of who gets to be counted as a full citizen. The journey from a privilege for a tiny elite to a near-universal right took over 150 years of struggle and reform. It was a dramatic expansion of who even counts as a citizen. And that brings us to a final question to think about. What does the next chapter of this story even look like?